You can't miss the London Eye, really.
Right. You have an announcement about
a brief intermission, and it's just before your final session. And for those people amongst us who are garden specialists, we've had an opportunity to get Mark Laird across from Canada. He produces a book called The Flowering of the English Landscape Garden, and we're having a seminar with him on the Thursday the 29th of this month. So this is out of the stream of the normal AM teaching as a sort of special day. So if you want to come, do take a leaflet. Many of you have already got one. If you know anybody who you think might want to come, pick one up, and I'll leave it on the desk here, okay? He'll be talking about the fashions for plants in the 18th century and the fashions for the use of plants in the 18th century, and how what we now take as for granted, like shrubberies and the design of flower gardens and so forth, is in fact had to be a sort of fairly well crafted invention to break away from the formal style that was dominated by the French. And he'll also illustrate what he is talking about by his practical work at places like Painshill, where he's now had 6 years experience, some triumphs, some disasters, but he can talk about all those to see how the ideas actually work out in practice. So I'll leave this on the table.
Right. Well, some of us have to go quite early, so we ought to try and concentrate our thoughts on conservation, its holistic aspects, as done by you, okay, and start off with that. Now, you have put forward a view of conservation which I think it must be really quite difficult to disagree with. We have, in fact, been people who have put lines round monuments and gardens and all those things with feeling that almost certainly we were doing a good job. And I would like to defend that concept a little bit, in that the fact that the lines were put round it have meant that in many cases those objects have survived. And they are very often the center of an area, marking the center of an area. So that although the whole area did not get the attention that it may have demanded or needed, at any rate, the core has been kept. You don't blame it for that, do you?
I think that's why I should have crossed out old and new, and that's why I put the plus signs in, because I think that we, as a discipline, are growing, and there are things that we've learned to do over many years which we mustn't forget how to do, and things that we need to add to that.
Do seize that thing.
All right.
Sorry, I will. Yeah.
For me, one of the jobs I think of a professional in conservation is to try to look forward. Now, I had a sort of debate at lunchtime over whether or not we can anticipate the values of future generations. But any of us who've ever worked with a local community know that quite often they won't have articulated what is valuable. And how can I say this? Let me give you an example. I've been dealing with a coal mine in Stoke-on-Trent. It's a very, very controversial thing to conserve. For much of the local community, they're not interested in the coal mine, they're not interested in the buildings, they want to forget that episode of their history. But as a professional involved in conservation, I bet you anything you like that in 10 or 15 years' time, we will realise that the buildings and sites of the coal industry are part of the history of Britain and have a meaning and have a value. And, as has been done in the Ruhr, these are buildings that we can work with and learn from and be inspired by. So I think the activity of drawing lines around things is sometimes important when we want to take conservation forward. It's something we have to do and we will continue to have to do.
It may be a first step.
Yes, and it's part of the process of pioneering, and it's something that you often have to do.
So you wouldn't stop us drawing a line, provided we go on from there.
Yes.
Good.
And I think the important thing is to recognise that there is potential value in everything. That's an interesting question.
Yes, that is a pretty difficult thing to go around life doing the whole time, realising the potential value of everything we're doing and seeing and looking at and so on. It means one's pretty heavily occupied most of the time. But we will try. Now,
can I just perhaps make a comment there?
Speech.
If the first step was drawing lines around things, and the second step is the integration of different elements of conservation, I think the third step quite clearly has to be embracing more widely notions of sustainable development, of which the element of conservation only holds, if you like, one aspect, and the notion of social and economic and community-based sustenance is also quite important. What that means is that once you've reached a consensus across the conservation professions, if you like, then those are going to be moderated, and I'm sure this will be unpopular in this group, by other different value systems which are concerned with society and economy. Everything has a value in terms of its conservation merit, but that's competing with a much broader range of values which are not to do with the past, but are to do more with the present and the future. And the notion of sustainable development is actually very futuristic in terms of its obligations to our future generations, if indeed we have any, because demography seems to suggest the more affluent we get, the more likely we are to breed ourselves out of existence altogether. So in a sense, the future generations 5 times down the line might not matter because they might not exist by our own choice or choices made. But the point I'm making is that you can carry only a certain amount of baggage from the past before it begins to get in the way of the kinds of things you need to do in the future. And I've characterised that by the fact that when we moved house, my heritage was in the loft in boxes, and I actually threw it away, and it was a very liberating process to have done so because it focused my mind on the present. And I think that's not to decry the value of conservation, but simply to say that step 2 is certainly integrating a disparate range of conservation values and importances, but step 3 is probably less attractive to those with their hearts in conservation, which is actually to begin a process of some denial if it's clearly the case that there has to be a present that is about social and economic welfare, particularly in relation to things like poverty, the distribution of wealth, social exclusion and that kind of stuff. And those things can be dealt with not just through conservation or even environmental measures. The solution to the hell that is our urban environments that Martin was talking about isn't actually energy efficient houses as much as social policies and economic policies that alleviate poverty, that help to ameliorate antisocial behaviour, that provide education so that people can come and appreciate the kinds of things that we have been talking about today. And it's about those value systems and changing value systems and education in that context that you have to begin to bring into the equation, which will mean undoubtedly some sacrifices to the conservation objective as an exclusive thing. Now that's not a nice view to have to take in many senses. It's not a comfortable view. But if you're going to bring the wider population as opposed to a room full of very educated middle class people on board, those are the kinds of things that are going to happen.
Can I respond to that? Because
Yes.
I think there's a very significant...
We are talking about landscape.
Yeah. Okay. But there is a very significant difference between the potential of everything to have a value and keeping everything. They're not the same thing at all. And I think what I'm saying is that conservation is about reconciling different values, and in order to do that we need to start by articulating that. Of course we lose things. We lose things every day, all the time, and that is part of conservation. That's why I use the definition managing change. All I'm doing is suggesting we use a wider range of values to manage change, and that those values are more socially responsible than they have been in the past. And when you talked about working with communities and societies, some of their values are rooted in who they are, who they have been, their identity, and how they value places, for whatever reason that they value places. So I'm not arguing for a fossilisation of a whole landscape. I'm simply arguing for a reconciliation of values in how we manage change and move forward. And ironically, in conservation
And
planning...
perceive value, as possible.
Yeah. In the conservation planning work I've been doing with architects, they've said to me that ironically, the better you understand why a place is important, the easier it is to change it responsibly. And I think that's the basis of my argument.
Could I add on?
Yes, I don't want to get stuck on one subject. However, I'd like to come back to on an international subject, if I may. I know that Martin is having to run, and so I'd like to pose a few questions in his direction. One thing that certainly in this course here on conservation of landscape and gardens, we do very little about indeed is nature conservation. Now, have you got any words of wisdom for us as to how we ought to consider nature conservation in relation to parks and gardens, pinning it down to rather a narrow thing?
Yeah, I think, I don't know where it seems to be in land. Yeah, I think that there have been improvements. I mean, there are woodlands which I visit and walk in London, such as Queenswood in Muswell Hill and so on, where there is far more appreciation of leaving areas wild and not keeping it all tidied up and cutting back the undergrowth all the time in order to make the wood look like some kind of garden, so that area can support more wildlife. I mean, even funny little sort of stories like I think in the Royal Parks at one stage they decided that rather than sawing the branches off trees that needed sawing off, they got the army in to blow them off with dynamite. It was apparently good practice for the army to work out exactly how much charge they needed to blow down this particular bit of tree, and it left a very good area for sort of birds and beetles and so on to breed and live afterwards. So I think there are some processes. Planting as well is very important. You need to make sure that the right plants are there to sustain local wildlife. Bringing in foreign species can very often find that many of our local species of insects and so on can't feed on the foreign species of tree. So those things need to be taken onto board. And of course, I think the other important role of public spaces such as parks is as an education facility. And if in various park areas we do see nature reserves and little ecological centres set up for the local schools and so on, if they can be combined with parkland and leisure areas, I think again that is another way of spreading the ideas of looking after nature and so on. I mean, they really are, particularly in London. There's such a fantastic amount of parkland, and I don't know if people have been looking lately on the internet. You can now get the aerial photographs for most of London. If you go to the right website and click on the button, you get all the aerial photos, and it's staggering how green it is. So I think we are lucky, but we do obviously need to make sure that we make the best use of those spaces that we can.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah. I'm coming from this mining situation, which is sort of generally considered to be a devastated landscape, and there is quite a lot of money available to make it nice again and re-green it. There are greening programs, and there's quite various pots of money for re-greening. And we are using these pots of money, but we don't re-green. We don't think this is the right policy in this situation, because it is what I call this playing God policy. And I think it is also robbing the landscape, really, of an immediate cultural past, an immediate cultural history. And I think people don't feel they belong to this, this re-greened landscape. And I think this is all very well meant. And we are coming to landscapes that have been re-greened by local ecological initiatives. And they are, in a way, with the whole second nature character of the landscape has been blurred, has been washed over with this green. And it's within the situation to sort of give character and give awareness of a cultural immediate past is becoming much more complex and much more difficult.
I take it that you're not actually resisting the green. I mean, grass grows quite quickly, and wildflowers come back with amazing rapidity, and trees suddenly appear.
Yes.
You don't go around and tear them up.
Yeah, but for example, the birch trees are coming very quickly.
Yes.
And
They're the first.
they're the first that are coming back very quickly. And okay, this is part of the process, of a more natural process. But funnily enough, these birch trees are being taken out because they are thought to be part of this coal landscape, and they are being replaced by proper trees. And I don't understand that at all, because the birch tree is a very nice tree. I mean, it's a very happy tree. The sun is reflecting on the stem.
Beautiful white stem.
The leaves are it's a lot of sun and a lot of light, so it's a wonderful tree. So why change this tree against another tree?
Well, I'm with you, actually. Friends of the Earth have an opinion on this.
It's not an opinion on birch trees, I promise. I think, actually, when we talk about green spaces, I think we should be careful that we are not restricting ourselves to things which are green. I mean, in fact, probably the most important wildlife site in London is really brown rather than green. It's the marsh out at Raynham, and it's an area where sort of hundreds of, or thousands of birds feed. It's one of the sort of final feeding places they can. It's just a great big mud flat. I mean, it really isn't an attractive parkland, and it's not some greenwash, nice sort of contrived area. But Friends of the Earth, along with sort of lots of local community groups in the area, have put together a plan to save that, and we call it a green space, which maybe is misleading, but I think if we said, would you help us save this big patch of mud, we probably wouldn't get quite so much support. So, but with local community groups and local people there, we have actually drawn up a plan which we're sort of starting to win support for. It's been a long old struggle from the local council and so on to save this and to make it available to local people to use as a resource and to use as an educational resource as well, rather than concreting it over, which is what the local authority wanted to do. So I think green spaces is much more than just green spaces. I think we need to.
I think we take it with quotes, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But there is a problem about doing too much. And I think this is really, but in my experience, it is a real problem of doing too much and doing with the best will of the world, but things becoming more difficult to understand. The landscape becomes more difficult to understand, and there is a pleasure in understanding a landscape. There's a pleasure for people to understand what is, if you like, man-made and what is natural. There's a pleasure to understand that, and this possibility of understanding is often taken away with this very good will.
I think it's a very nice concept to let it teach us.
Yes.
Come back on its own and not cover it with begonia multiflora.
And react to it.
Yes.
One of the ironies of the modern transport system, well, the road and rail system is that the road and rail verges are a very, very important habitat for wildflowers and for small mammals. And I wondered what Friends of the Earth could comment on that.
Yeah, there are small mammals living on road verges and so on, but I don't think there's many people around who would argue that overall we benefit from, or our wildlife benefits from the roads. As I said, there is this problem with wildlife breeding down the sides of it. There's also the problems of the numbers of
I
animals.
beg your pardon, if you'd seen the cowslips on the roads in Wiltshire, and also when you go through to Bristol on the train, we might not have any cowslips left if there weren't any road verges and rail.
That's part of diversity of habitat, I think.
Yeah.
Could we abolish best kept villages?
Sorry, Mavis, what?
Could we abolish the prize for the best kept village where they come and slash all your counterparts they don't
Or the best restored site. Yes, well, I think this is part, we're agreed, probably, that we don't really want to cover everything with Flora roses and so on, which is what gets the prize. The biggest amount of brightest colour gets the prize, and that may not be a very sophisticated solution.
Crucifying daffodils up poles too, that's another thing.
Right? We will have a campaign, ladies, to abolish these futile...
Baskets outside the front door.
Yes, please.
Going back to the previous conversation, what Professor Bible did with his site in Germany was put green roofs on most of the houses, which is very good for the insulation, pleases our friends of the air people, also replaces the land that you've just built on, albeit up in the sky, and isn't terribly radical in Germany, I don't think, but would be totally astonishing over here. So that it's a sort of seems to be a slightly different value system that they're putting on things. They take for granted.
This is a question or
It's just
a statement.
It's just a comment.
Yes. Well, who's going to comment on roof gardens and green roofs? Anybody wish to hear?
I guess I could just simply say that I was astonished to visit my first thatched cottage and observe, there's a name for them, some absolutely enormous spiders that live up in there. So you do have some habitat up
But in England, that would just be a concrete roof with asphalt on it and absolutely nothing else. So, that's a fairly simple way of just changing it.
Well, perhaps this will become one of the things we look at. We might even get better insulation if we had that on top too. So that's something. I'd like to switch for a moment to the consideration of internationality. We have tried to construct this conference to bring in views from Europe and America, other places. Is that something that you who attend these conferences find to be valuable? We believe it to be an important thing. It is so easy to get tucked into one's own recipes for conservation when trying to teach it, etc., that simply we don't look around us at all. And I'd like to ask you, Elizabeth, whether coming here from the States has been a very benefit to you.
Oh yes, absolutely. Let's see if this will work. How's that? There, very good. I said to Kate in the interval, or perhaps Nigel, or both of them, that I really, because of the particular work that I had to do early in my career, I was asked by the National Trust for Historic Preservation to figure out how do you take historic preservation, which is primarily urban in the United States, and create a rural version of that. And so we studied this country, because you do many things well here. And American planners also like to think that you do many things in the planning world quite well, and you do it from your own values. And I think there's some American values that, as a heretic in my planning profession, I often argue that Americans are Americans, and they're going to create an American landscape and not a British one with our system. But it's very helpful to come and first of all get updated on where things are, and we're using very much the same language and thinking hard about the same concepts. And I've had some wonderful sidebar conversations with some of my colleagues, and many of you in the audience. I've had some great stimulating conversations. It's actually very helpful to hear not from England as much as the Netherlands and the German example, because it just adds a new dimension to your thinking, and I really appreciate that. This has been a wonderful experience for 2 days of just constantly building on very challenging ideas, and I think part of the magic of a conference like this is having all of us in the same room for long enough that we all have, the shared mixing bowl experience of all these things, and we'll all take different things away, I think, but for me, I think it has broadened that sense that, yes, I can find a home for the dialogue that I hold with my colleagues in the United States here, and I think I see different strengths from different parts of the conversation. Maybe that's a little bit vague, but I'm not sure how to be much more specific at this hour.
The thing I was absolutely dazzled by, as I always am in the States, is that the efficiency of organization. You have managed to organize your conservation effort in the States, probably better than in any other nation, with the possibility exception of Australia, by which I'm always amazed. But the thing that has saddened me most was you said, we no longer believe that we can do anything right. Now, for the most self-confident nation in the world, producing still very remarkable architecture and doing a world leadership job, that amazed and terrified me. Is that really the way you see it?
Well, I guess the slower answer to that kind of expression, I'm not even sure exactly where that came out in my remarks, but I think Kate also was expressing the notion, and several of us have really, that we're in a more pluralistic society. I think one of the interesting contributions in the planning world that I noticed, my practice started, just before 1980. Somewhere in the early 1980s, we started using the word vision. We use it a lot now, and commonly, but
I wish I knew what it meant.
Well, I think, well. Well, George Bush kind of gave it a really bad name back in his presidency, or Ronald Reagan even. But I think the reason that it came out, and it became de rigueur to create a vision first before we did any of the other planning steps, okay? Why was that? And the reason, I think, is because we simply could no longer stand on the same ground together. We couldn't assume that we were standing on the same ground, that we actually had to establish that ground from the beginning, that we were no longer white male planning engineers. And in our country, the planning profession really stems from civil engineering, and that there were not universal values that we could immediately assume would be expressed in our plan. But I will say that it's still an uncomfortable process. It's constantly working to broaden your view, and I think you have to constantly ask yourself, are we doing it right? Maybe I shouldn't have said we aren't doing it right, but I think the question is constantly saying, are we taking account of enough? Are we bringing in the ecosystem? Are we remembering when we pass legislation for insulation that we're also going to be affecting the historic fabric of buildings? Are we, so there's this long checklist. Yes.
Is this vision? I thought vision was looking ahead and seeing what one wanted to do.
Well, that's because I think, yes, you're creating a picture. It's a virtual reality. You're trying to express some kind of virtual reality, because in a lot of ways, planning is so difficult to express in a linear, on-the-page fashion as we write our plans. And it's one of the wonders of the design world is that you draw also, and that the drawing is so important also. But visioning is really, in a verbal and collective sense, working out that sense of virtual reality, so that even if your plan doesn't quite get it, there's a common understanding, a common sense of principles that, as you move through time, you still have this vision to check in with. And that's why it's so important. But maybe that doesn't exactly answer the question, but the getting it right part is really hard.
Even further into the mile.
I was asked to launch a vision by someone. What should I have done?
Thrown a bottle of champagne at it.
Yes, the launch.
Yeah. That seems to me to be all part of the gathering together of information about the thing you're considering, so that you have got the largest possible amount of various different types of information about the thing, from which you then draw the vision of what you wish to do with it.
I think I need to argue with that on one basis, and that is, in serving in the Department of the Environment in Pennsylvania, I was part of many decisions on permits and other things. You can never have enough information to make the decision. That is, so you must make decisions without all the information. And one of the principal reasons that you use visioning is because you're accounting for, you're beginning to bring out values and principles as opposed to information. And so I absolutely don't quarrel with the need for information, with the need for inventory throughout a planning process and on into its implementation, so that you're constantly building on what you know. But you often have to decide without enough information.
I think we're into semantics almost. Envisioning would be exactly that. in our dictionary terms. Vision would be looking ahead.
Yes.
So, sorry, Nigel would like to say to them something.
Just a quick word about the notion of learning from international experiences. That there seem to be, for me, and it's something I haven't quite sorted out in my own mind, in government policy, particularly rural policy in the rural white papers, a tension between the advantages and inevitability on the one hand of globalisation and internationalisation, and on the other, the increased importance of local distinctiveness and local identity. And I think the importance here is to get clear the difference between principles and processes which we're learning from all the time in a global stage, and, if you like, outcomes which I think we're beginning to understand need to be more locally determined. There seems to be no argument at all about the folly of using non-native species to develop certain types of landscape. That notion also extends not just to landscapes but to certain other cultural factors as well. That we can learn things from the international and global experience, but we must be discriminating about those so that we don't impair the notion of local distinctiveness and sense of place. A good conundrum for me is the notion of the roof garden. It's not part of British culture, it is part of European culture. I have no answer as to whether therefore it's a good thing to transport the idea of a roof garden to Britain or not, because that's an outcome rather than a process. And I guess many people will say, well, no, that's not actually an indigenous part of what we're trying to do. And others might say, well, yeah, it's more energy efficient. I think you can't universally say these kinds of things naturally transpose themselves. There have been a number of elements of planning policy that have been absolute disasters when translated from the American to British context and the other way round, because people haven't understood the difference between outcome and process.
Thank you. A good warning. Michael, we haven't heard anything from you yet, but you managed to change my mind this morning, so that's quite an event. I was very persuaded by what you told us about Milton Keynes. It seemed to me that the original concept of it was a most imaginative and radical rethinking of what the interrelationship between town and country could produce as a living place. Now, I was equally despairing to hear that there is almost no government attention being devoted to the concept of the 21 new towns that we have got to have developed. Surely that is a vast and important new development for this country, enormously important to the landscape. And what advice would you give?
Well, we're going to finish at 5. No, the major difference. I mean, I've been tempted to come in it a few times, but for example, if we go to your thing of vision in another setting, I'd like a bottle of wine on the table and we'd have a long evening.
I think that would be great.
Because the vision is actually a remarkable mechanism in humankind. The idea of you clearly wanting something means that you quickly identify the resources, and they do tend to come into your life. For example, once you decide, as I did, that I wanted a car soon after I was 17, then everything else becomes the means of getting that car. And if we were to embrace some of the suggestions that were made by Friends of the Earth as a shared vision, then the resources are there to do it. We are choosing not to do it. The resources are there.
Yes, we are always selecting.
Now, if we go back to Milton Keynes just quickly, all that happened with the New Town Programme, and particularly with Milton Keynes, was that there was a government vision to create this place. It was given adequate resources, it was given adequate time and adequate powers. None of those things are available today, but the situation is far...
They're available.
They're available, but we're choosing not to do them.
Yeah.
But as you look to the future, I think the issue of equity, and of course intergenerational equity, but we have got to recognize not just how these places are going to look, but also 40% of the 4.4 million homes that we've heard about today, they will have to come from the social housing sector For the first time, we're filling up the social housing sector, and there is a real danger that parts of Milton Keynes will become the council estate, while somewhere else down the M4 will get the nicer middle-class bits. There is an equity issue. There is also an issue that we simply don't have enough builders to build these 4.4 million houses. The business of transporting sufficient cement and everything around is actually, and gravel is a major problem. We should begin to start looking at the American examples and the Norwegian examples to take the theme of internationalism and start looking at wooden housing, which our banks don't like lending money on. So I've set out a few themes there, because it is the case that we still can't get banks and building societies to be enthusiastic about timber-framed housing. And a final one on that, just while the ideas come in, is we are building our discussion today, rural encroachment on housing and everything, on the premises of the 20th century, which were that if you could go to a bank and show that you were working, you got a mortgage for 25 years in the post-war period. That premise is going away with contracts and everything else, so that we have a new client group, we need new building materials, and we, above all, need the sort of vision which was around in the 1960s.
But
we can and we will.
There is a government actually not helping at all to produce a vision of these places.
Everybody,
what have we got to do to stir up that government?
well, everybody's been chucking around book titles. The most important book I've read in recent years is Kenneth Galbraith's The Culture of Contentment, which sets out that the middle class are simply no longer willing to pay tax, and that any tax that is expended must immediately benefit the local middle class. And this has served to change the nature of all elections in America and Europe, and is above all serving to limit the choices or the options that governments are willing to embrace, the visions they're willing to undertake as we look to the rest of this century. That's probably not the most optimistic note to make towards the end of a conference. But I was having an interesting argument at lunchtime about what planning is about. But it is, these deficiencies are beginning to come to the fore and are limiting us. And we could do worse than to spend a little bit more time on vision.
Would not that be a good thing? That is what this country actually has most signally lacked, in my view.
Lost.
Has lost.
Yes, not lacked.
Well, right. We're arguing a closely knit thing.
Oh, no.
Yes.
In 1967, we shall create a city of 250,000. You may not like the outcome.
We had a vision of putting down all the middles of our cities.
1990, we need to build a new town. Who's going to build it for us? And of course, at that point, all ability to influence the outcome, because actually the government is now brokering arrangements between landholders and builders. You can't influence landscapes and everything else when you're doing that. It's only when you are paying the piper can you call the tune.
So, well, thank you for that depressing advice. Yes.
Dinner last night was great fun for the speakers and some of the invited guests, and I just wanted to say that I was told about the 1973 Country House Estates exhibit.
Yes.
Why not have a 30th anniversary in a couple of years and take on some of these difficult questions in an exhibition form and draw in designers and artists and planners to really put forward a new dialogue and try to make it as influential as that 1973 exhibition was. They can do that.
On the landscape.
On the landscape, on the British landscape.
There is a splendid suggestion. And who should we get to design it, Mavis? I think we'll get Roy Strong. He is going to be our new president, isn't he? Or I'm not allowed to say that. Oh, well, there, we haven't said it. But somebody like that. And we will have an absolutely zonking exhibition on the destruction of the landscape and how we can build a new and beautiful one. That would be wonderful. I'd love that. And you put one on in New York too, will you?
Oh, we should do it together.
We'll do that. Okay, something of that sort. there is a woman of infinite resource, like my wife there. And between you, you should do it. And we shall sit round and applaud. That's it. A very nice solution to that, and Mavis will do it too. 3 of the strongest ladies in the country. So, what other bits? Over to you now. What else would you like to raise?
I'd like to talk about something which has occurred to me quite recently, because I've got grandchildren who are growing up, and I live, and they do, in different parts of London, but in North London, in Hampstead suburb, which is a sort of an environmentally protected area, and you can't move without sort of getting approval for it. And the basic problem is or one of the problems is where can children play in this area? I mean, when I was a kid, I lived in the Ladbroke estate in West London, and there was quite a lot of bomb damage, and we played in the bomb damage, and that was great fun. And the problem at the moment is that children don't go out, they stay at home and they watch screens.
Well,
and
they're
things.
kept at home because we are
You're
very, very worried about them being allowed on their own.
There's a lack of safety. Well, if there was, I mean, this is partly a plea to landscape, because I'm not a landscape architect, I'm an ordinary architect, to think again about this, about sort of getting children out, getting children to play together in places like old bomb sites.
Well, what about urban parks, the regeneration of urban parks?
Opportunities Fund is supposed to be all about this, because they took money from the HLF. There was a big, as you know, Urban Parks programme on the HLF, and then that finished. But there was a great deal done about the security. It wasn't just money for landscape. They actually bought back some of the lodges that had been asset stripped and put park keepers in them again. There was a whole policy about the security side of it. But now the New Opportunities Fund, if they don't take it all for the dome, that is also looking again into these, could we call green spaces or whatever we want to call them, places for children to play safely, so that if you want to put anything,
I
that's...
don't want them to play safely.
Well, what do you want?
Sense. I want them to play...
Well, they can't, of course. I mean, you
taking
can't...
risks themselves.
Well, you can't have... I mean, one of the things I think about my poor grandchildren, I used to walk into woods when I was 8-year-old to play amongst the trees. Well, that's all past, isn't it? I mean, you've got to have security. There are no two ways about it.
Why now as opposed to then?
Well, because there weren't all these nasty types about.
Oh,
they weren't. They weren't.
I'm sure
We went with the this AA garden conservation course to Denmark last summer, I think it was, and we went to see some of the early adventure playgrounds laid out by Sorensen. You didn't come, I don't think, but it was a very inspiring experience, and they were greatly successful. They were all attached to housing, well, nearly all attached to housing estates. There was one residential one in which all the plots were circular, you probably know it, and every family that had a plot also had a sort of a glorified hut. And a lot of them spent the whole summer in these huts, in these allotments. I suppose they were really allotments. But the children played around the outer perimeter of these circles. But the most important one was in a town context within a large housing estate. It had about 100 children when we were there playing, and they were doing all sorts of creative types of play, both sexes, and why it was such a success was that there were about 20 staff supervising them, I suppose.
Yeah, but they weren't...
A lady in a hut, knitting.
Yeah, exactly.
And she had elasticus. But there was somebody around, but they're all done out to contractors who come round once. There was a dedicated gardener in the garden
I must let Nigel come in here because he's got something important to say.
I don't know about that.
I think I do. Come on.
I think one of the problems with children's play is that we are, to a degree, victims of our own middle-class sanitized value systems about children's play. We've just finished doing a longitudinal survey for the Countryside Agency of things called Millennium Greens. Now, these were to break new ground because they were to be local spaces for the whole community, designed and determined by the community. At last, people could have what they wanted. Except there was some national criteria laid down by the Countryside Agency that precluded anything but sanitised play. There had to be nice areas of, grasses and flowers and all this kind of stuff. So communities had to ask themselves what they wanted as a condition of grant aid. And in many areas, particularly in urban as opposed to sort of around rural areas, they wanted skateboard parks, they wanted BMX tracks, they wanted bomb sites, effectively the metaphor for bomb sites. Sorry, can't have that because that's beyond the conditions of the grant. The New Opportunities Fund is claiming that it's now going to redress that balance, but it still requires funding to be undertaken through application by the local community. And whilst community participation is a wonderful thing, one of its hallmarks for me, having researched it for a number of years, is that you get the most articulate communities get in all the dosh. And the most articulate communities are us. It's the middle-class sanitised value system again. So the people who lose out in competitive bidding, no matter how philanthropic it's characterised, are the people who want this kind of play. And I think what we have problems with is we put philanthropic good intent into a system of bounded rules that actually precludes us doing this kind of thing. And I think it's a shame, basically. But
surely we don't all want daisy chains. We want good old rumble-tumble places for the children to enjoy themselves and invent them splendid games.
Depends who the we is. I mean, the we that is me thinks that's fantastic, but the we that dominates policy and public funding bidding is the we that likes the daisy chains.
Oh, God. You go into the new Diana one with your grandchildren.
Well, what we don't want is rape.
Sorry, could I just... the thing about...
of the oil seed
my
variety.
grandchildren is they've just come back from Copenhagen, where they've been living for a couple of years. And also the thing that has really brought this up, looking at where we live in North London, is that there are two woods. There's Littlewood and Bigwood, and the trees have just grown and grown and grown, and it's sort of paths through dark tree bits full of rapists, I'm sure. And all you can do is take your dog for a walk and it scampers off into the
I should keep it close to me.
And they shit in the stuff.
Yes.
And it's all wet because it doesn't dry out. Now, the thing about that is it's been turned, both these areas have been turned into nature places because nobody will go in them except the birds in the trees. And that's a problem too.
Yes, well, I've dealt with that problem on two cases. I'm not going to go into that dog problem now. I absolutely won't have dogs. Now, any more questions from the floor? Yes.
I just want to bring up that word again, the vision that you brought up. I think it's very important, but not only on the grand scale of government. Of course, that's necessary, but on the local level as well. When we think of, what's her name was talking about character maps and this I think was very illuminating. It was a wonderful way of thinking about what you people call conservation. But when we think of those places that have real character, very often they've come about by probably one or a few people with vision. Either they were designers that had a vision, or they were clients that had vision, or they were philanthropists in the old days, and they said, "I'm going to give my country house, and it's going to be a park, and it's going to be Hampstead Heath one day," and they were people with vision. They knew that would be necessary in the future. They didn't do it just because they thought it was a nice idea. They had vision. Now, what I'm asking, it's a question really, is what can we do to support a process which brings about projects. There's not that many people that have vision in our world. I don't believe that. I mean, we all have a certain amount, but I think there's some people that really demonstrate a lot of vision. Yeah. What can we do to bring about projects at any scale, which the result will be a visionary project, which has a lot of identity, gives us something to that we would want to conserve one day?
Gosh, I haven't the least idea, because as you say, visionaries are very unusual people. Great artists are very unusual people, and I don't know how you breed them.
Can I say something on that? Is that if you take lessons from the business school, I spent a little bit of time in the business school, and whenever you're managing management of change, it's very important that you create the climate that is not intimidating to the visionaries. I mean, we live in a very cynical climate. I said I spent time in Australia, and one of the greatest shocks when I came back to Britain in 1992 was coming to terms with the climate of cynicism, because one of the things that you experience in Australia is it's almost a teenage culture, because people are forever dreaming dreams and saying things. Most of them don't come off. But in contrast, any visionary statement here tends to have to run the gauntlet of the skeptics and the cynics very quickly. So that we may need to come back a bit and basically think about the preconditions for envisioning. Because people do have them, but they just say, I'm not going to say anything. I mean, for example, have we not, all enjoyed the downfall of the dome? That started off as a vision. But unfortunately, it ran smack bang up against British culture. And although it's proved since then to be a terrible, bottomless bucket in terms of useful funds, £29 million recently, it did start off as a vision.
Yes, it did start off as a vision. And just why it went wrong and where it went wrong will be the subject of investigation for years to come.
But didn't we love it once it started to go down the drain?
Well, it is always lovely to see people hit the mud, isn't it? When the great hit it bad, then we love it.
Could I just say something about the kind of vision that you were talking about, which in a sense is harking back to the visionaries of the past, and it ties in with what you said earlier, that we only know people to have been visionary if to a large extent their visions came to pass. Otherwise we didn't know they were visionary. Their visions came to pass by and large because of a phenomenal inequality of wealth that we just don't have today, that people who had the philanthropy could also afford the philanthropy to open those visions to the population at large. But she was pretty well connected. I mean, in terms of political and exact...
Modestly.
Okay, well, let's not call it financial wealth, but let's call it the ability, either financial or political, to bring change about. And I think one of the reasons why visionaries are less visible today is because actually we don't have such an inequality of wealth or influence, and therefore people tend to be moderately more satisfied with what they have, or less able to achieve the visions that earlier people did.
I want to make this more happy, because actually I found this conference amazingly invigorating. That I came here with fairly dimmed down expectations, actually. I didn't know how good it was going to be. But I think it's been better than that. And also, I feel that my attitude as a conservationist to change has been altered. Yes. That I no longer view change as an enemy, as a thing to be suspicious of the whole time, but as a thing often to welcome. The only thing you know about change is that things are going to be different. You can't be absolutely certain it's going to be better, and you can't be absolutely certain it's going to be worse. And that our attitude to change ought therefore to be more liberal than that most of the conservation setup views it. And that, if I have one little tiny thing to give you as a result of this conference, it's that, I think. Yes, come on, kill it.
Hello. I'd like to take issue with what you've just said about the difference between a number of people who are wealthy and poverty in this country. I don't know whether it still is, but under the last government at least, it was the widest it's been for 200 years. And there are a large section of the population who are struggling. I would just like to say that. Another thing I'd like to suggest is that if we're really serious about this issue of conservation, my view of it is that we need to embrace open spaces everywhere in cities and rural spaces. And if we do, we inevitably cross cultural divide. Because if we're serious, we here express our ideas to councils and planners and to schools, and talk to children about it, talk to people of all professions and all walks of life. And it should cut across cultural divides. It shouldn't be a middle-class issue, so to speak. And also, I think, one of the things that's come out, especially with the speaker from the Friends of the Earth, that if we're serious about this conservation issue, we have to address issues in our own lives, such as the use of cars, such as taxation, such as planning. And I think it all involves dialogue, constant dialogue. And that's in a sense, what I would see as the vision, is the constant dialogue and the constant reaching out to people and exchange of ideas.
We jolly well ought to get onto more parish councils for a start. Tend not to get onto them. And yet that is where half of the important decisions of this country are made. And where there ought to be far more people prepared to give time to look after parish councils. The parish council of Deadsdale is one of the last great democracies in this country. And it runs that place with amazing conservation energy. And we could do far more on our local councils than we do. We ought to get down to that.
Could I just briefly respond to those 2 points and effectively agree with both of them? That I think in terms of wealth distribution is becoming increasingly bimodal, increasingly that there are quite a large number of rich and quite a large number of poor, and that gap is widening. But that's quite different from the sort of Victorian notion of a very small number of very rich people, where that sort of philanthropy became more visible, and I agree that's a problem. I very much agree also with the notion of crossing cultural divides, but one of the issues for me there is that if you're going to cross cultural divides, you need to embrace multicultural value systems. And until you've done that, you're not going to make any progress at all.
I think that's right.
I do a lot of work in countryside recreation. The Countryside Agency is always saying to me, we're going to develop policies to get Afro-Caribbeans, Asians into the countryside. And I'm saying, well, hang on a minute, ask them whether they want to go first. Because actually the English countryside is not part of their cultural heritage and may not mean much to them. And after a number of years of busing people into the countryside from ethnic areas in Nottingham and so forth, and nobody wanting to go, it all of a sudden dawned on them that actually it wasn't their preference. They weren't constrained from doing it in any way, but they just had a different cultural value system, which actually for my money was hugely attractive. It was about extended families and spending time with large numbers of people that they felt close to and all that kind of stuff, rather than walking over Ben Nevis or whatever. You've got to not have value systems that prioritise those two things, and you've got to accept that broader range, which I think is brilliant. But you can't, even with philanthropic good intent, go and say, look, we want to embrace your cultural situation. You need to act in the following way because we want to embrace you in that. You have to first listen before you speak, and what you say might be very different than what your current value system is.
Well, let's keep the English countryside, though, shall we?
Well, there's in keeping it for those people who want to use it.
It is quite a good point to listen occasionally. And also, for those of us who are visionaries and are not enormously rich, think perhaps of St. Paul. He achieved quite a lot. He had almost no money at all. The whole of the Christian religion was set up by that man, practically, on a text. So think what can be done. No wealth but what?
There is no wealth but life. I just put the stone on.
Well, there we are. That's a good one too. No wealth but life. And in it you can achieve an amazing amount.
Particularly if you've got a lot of money.
Well, it'll help you. But don't despair if you haven't. Thank you all for coming.
Oh, thank you. Oh.